All right, here's our next set of triplets here. Rhythm, texture, and scale are all big elements of design. Rhythm we're very accustomed to thinking about in terms of sound, right? The rhythm of music or the rhythm of a heartbeat, repeated things that are in predictable intervals. Even if it's very complicated, the way a complicated rhythm might be very complicated, but it's predictable and therefore pleasing. And we can see that same thing visually. So repeated shapes at predictable intervals are pleasing, like a row of columns. Well, now we can take a look at an image like this one that has a lot of the elements that we were just talking about in terms of the rule of odds, right? There's 5 columns. We've got our subject matter, this guy walking down the columns here, sort of in between two of the columns. There's a lot of things that we've already taken a look at here. But if we remove one of those columns, then suddenly the balance and the composition is thrown way off. It's way left heavy now. We've got 4 columns now, which isn't good. We've got 3 on one side and then 1 all by itself over here, which is really struggling to balance the image, especially when the guy is on the left-hand side as well. There's a big gaping hole there that really makes for an odd composition. Well, if this is the way the columns actually were, and we caught the subject a few seconds earlier when he was right in the middle of that, now we've got this interesting framing element going on. And because he is right where the missing column would have been, it somewhat restores the rhythm. So we've got column, guy, column, column, column. So now we sort of have 5 elements here with the guy taking the place of the missing column. So this is sort of an interesting composition as well, just by moving the guy back where the column was missing. But you can really see how rhythm can be easily messed up in an image. Rhythm is easy to find in man-made objects. Stairs are great for rhythm. Anything that kind of window fenestration patterns, all that kind of stuff, very great for rhythm. Things that have man-made lines are easy to find rhythm in, but we can also find rhythm in nature. So wave patterns and the shapes of leaves and all kinds of stuff can be very powerful rhythm creating elements. All right, texture is kind of an interesting one. Texture is the surface quality of a form, right? So we can think about texture if you're texturing something in 3D modeling. You know, we're sort of saying, well, what is the surface shade, texture, the surface look of this object that I've created? I've modeled this thing that I want to look like rusty metal. So I'm going to apply a texture to that that looks like rusty metal. But texture is really important even in other kinds of images, even in a pencil drawing, right? Texture creates shape with highlight and shadow. So the way that light reflects or doesn't off the surface is what we really are talking about with texture. We can think about texture in terms of touching it, the actual tactile texture. We can't touch any of these photographs, and we get a really clear sense from our eyes about how these would feel if we were to touch them, right? With all of these pictures of ruined buildings, which I just love because they're full of so many interesting things, but I think those are really popular with photographers because there is so much variety of texture, and texture is created by highlight and shadow. All the peeling paint and the rubble and the broken bricks and all this kind of stuff creates interesting textures that create lots of interesting shadow and highlight shapes. And you can see contrasting textures creating interest. There's a lot of nudes in ruined buildings, right? Where the smooth texture of her skin contrasts a lot with all the rubble and broken glass and stuff going on in the image. And then the graphic style can create texture. So if you've got a real hatchy pen and ink kind of texture, or maybe it's a sort of very smooth pastel kind of smear, right? The way that you are using your materials can create texture. And so does the choice of the materials that you are using. Just charcoal, it just feels different than acrylics, which are kind of naturally smooth and shiny, right? And of course, you're probably familiar with the term impasto already, and that's actually texture created by the media itself. So like a Van Gogh painting that has big, thick blobs of paint on it, that's actual texture on the canvas. And then the surface texture of the material you're painting on, of course, is going to make a difference. So if you're actually painting on canvas or burlap or different kinds of presses of paper or on a rock or concrete or whatever, the surface that you're going to paint on is going to be affected by texture as well. Scale is a kind of a complicated one. Scale is a relative term. There's scale and proportion and a couple other things that we're going to talk about right here. So scale is a comparison of 2 sizes. Big dragon, smaller woman, or big dragon, normal sized woman, however you want to think about that. Here the scale is a little difficult to determine. What is this picture we're looking at? These sort of feet breaking through a box or something. I don't know. What are we looking at? Well, as soon as we take away the masking elements there and we see the woman and the windows and the room, now we get a sense of, oh, it's not a box, it's a room. And these are really freaking big feet, right, in this sculpture here. So it's a lot easier now to see the scale with the human figure in there, which is why I always insist with my designers that they include a human figure in their renderings so we can get a sense of the size of the image. Overwhelming scale seems to be a big thing right now, to where the boss villain or the monster or whatever is hugely big. And it makes you wonder, what does the Merler Queen eat every day to be so big? But that's a different thing. Measure drawings is a lot of what I do in terms of drafting. That's taking a drawing in a very specific scale relative to the full-sized object. So if this drawing here is in 1/16 to the foot inch. We oftentimes will use quarter inch or half inch or whatever. So we can take a ruler and put it down the drawing and measure something and tell how big it is on the piece of paper, and that will tell us how big it will be on the full-sized object by using that kind of scale. Proportion is a little different. Proportion is size relationships to other parts of an object or other parts of the composition. So here in Christina's world, we can see that she's taking a significant proportion of the image, even though we have this sort of vast chunk of field that's taking up a whole lot of canvas space with this tiny little ribbon, maybe, I don't know, what is that, like 1/6 maybe, the very top little strip of the image there that is the sky, and then we've got the house. So we're not looking at that house and saying like, oh, she's sitting in front of a dollhouse, or she's a giant out here in the field. No, we're getting the sense that there is the depth. The house is far away from her based on the proportion of the space that it is taking in the composition. So here this human figure, you can barely see him down there, the monk at the sea, is a tiny portion of the overall composition. That's just like, you see that all the time in romantic painting at the beginning of the 19th century. It's this sort of like tiny man and God's enormous creation, right? It's very much the theme of a lot of romantic art. And so here we have this tiny little monk that is being dwarfed by the sea in this relative to the proportions. And proportion is relative to known sizes. So we have to kind of know how big things are. And that's why the size of a person is so important in terms of understanding what we're looking at when we're seeing a rendering, a two-dimensional thing. Things can be out of proportion to exaggerate. So Spider-Man's head here is many times bigger than his body. It is out of proportion. You see that in art where a human body elements that are recognizable are sort of stretched, swollen, or shrunk, or whatever to create a desired effect. Scale and proportion for importance. So here we have the pharaoh much bigger than the other kings that he is conquering here. Not that the pharaoh is 9 feet tall, but in terms of the importance to the artist in this little bit of Egyptian wall art, the pharaoh is that much more important, so he's going to be that much bigger. And we see hierarchy, ranks based in size, is really common in graphic design. So you think about a newspaper headline, it's going to be man lands on moon, really big, and then there's going to be a subheadline talking about Apollo mission success, whatever, and then the body of the text, which is going to be much smaller. And so we're basically kind of ranking things based on how big they are. And of course, we can use scale and importance in an exaggerated effect. What's the thing that we're worrying about if we were to encounter a shark? Its teeth, right? So we're going to exaggerate the size of its toothy grin there to make that part of the shark more dangerous feeling. Proportion is relative to ratios, so we can think of a 1-to-1 ratio as a square. Both sides are the same side. A 1-to-3rd ratio, one side that is 1/3 as long as the other side, and so on. So we see this all the time in screen aspect ratios right now, and the 16:9 is real common. A lot of our high definition TVs and computer monitors are that 16:9 ratio, and maybe that's what you're looking at right now. And then of course those ratios go back into those proportions, those thirds, and then all of those sort of golden area proportions as well that go back to that spiral we were looking at before. We're sort of fascinated by miniature representations of much larger objects. We are as kids, and we have been all through time, and even as adults. And right now it's very common in sculpture to have crazy oversized objects playing with scale in the other direction as well. Also, it's important to think about scale in terms of scope and theme of an image. So here are 4 different images that are all basically, the eve of battle. You could term these, right, from the Lord of the Rings movies. So here we have this rendering of the campsites going off into the distance, this huge, vast plain with campfires, all these troops ready for battle, right? And then we've got the leader up here on the balcony kind of looking down at the assembled troops, right? Looking down at the orcs. And then we've got Gandalf and, is that Pippin? I can't remember who that is at this point. But on the balcony, quietly looking at the horizon, waiting is the worst part, whatever, this little intimate moment. And then we've got the little kids being fitted for armor down below Helm's Deep, right? That kind of horrifying moment in the films where we're really getting a sense of the scale of the battle to come by the fact that all these old men and kids are getting fitted with arms. Small details can tell a much larger story. We can look at the hands of the guy holding this coffee cup, and we're not picturing sort of a British businessman in a pinstripe suit and a bowler hat on the other side of these hands, right? The small detail can tell us a lot about the larger story. And there's a good example, too, different views of Dunkirk, right? The film, and then an actual photograph of the battle, right? But in the photograph here, because we're zoomed right into this guy, I just love the detail of the sand, sort of the abrasions on his knuckle there. It's like that right there in that small detail, the buckles, the weaving on his coat, all the sand caught in the fabric. It's like that extreme detail point of this. So yeah, there's a battle going on in the background, right? And if you look at the actual photograph down there, it's like, yeah, okay, you see some guys laying down in the grass. Not too unlike the image, but because we're a little farther away from them, we're not really kind of getting those intimate details. We're seeing a little bit more, the whole beach, but the story, the scope and scale of the story is very different. Same subject, different focal points. Really, the focal point, I think, of this image, this film shot is his knuckles. I just can't get away from the scarred knuckles there. Our next little grouping here is going to start here in a second. So we'll come back with dynamics, tension, and another one, and wrap this up.